This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 466, Progressive Migration. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we're talking about progressive migration with Drupal, what it is, and how you can do it within your organization. With our guest, Stephen Cross. We'll also cover Views JSON Source as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Stephen Cross. Stephen is part of the Talking Drupal team and a former host. That is true. He is a Drupal developer with the Department of Justice. Stephen, welcome back to the show. Long time no see. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's fun to be here again.
Look forward to talking about today's topic with you. I am John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the next 4 weeks. Nathan Denzow, Principal Consultant at Denzow, which is a development company turning ambitious ideas into scalable digital experiences. Nathan is a triple certified Drupal expert with 2 decades of software engineering experience. Nate, welcome to the show.
Hello.
And last but certainly not least, joining me as per the usual, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Nick, how's it going?
It's going well. Happy to be here.
Alrighty, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson Klutz for our module of the week. Martin is a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, take it away.
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to use Drupal's Views interface to allow visitors to browse and navigate data from another source? There's a module for that. It's called Views JSON Source, and it was created in April of 2020 by Pradeep Venugopal, or goes by Venugop, but recent releases are by Victor Holovacek, who goes by Aston Victor and is a member of the Ukraine Drupal community. It has a 2.0.2 version available, which is compatible with Drupal 8.8 and newer, all the way up to Drupal 11. Now, it is actively maintained and has security coverage. Doesn't have a lot in the way of documentation, but there is a pretty lengthy README to help you get started. And it has 17 open issues, 4 of which are bugs against the current branch, although one of those recently had a fix merged in. And actually, that was just in the last week, which is all pretty good considering that the module is officially in use by 1,641 sites, according to Drupal.org. Now, after installing the module, you can create a view and specify it to show JSON instead of some kind of content entity. In the view settings, you can then provide a URL for where to retrieve the JSON and an optional APAth value to indicate a section of the data to show. It also supports contextual filters, so you can create a single view that will show different sections of data depending on the path used to access it. From there, you can build out your view in the normal way, using fields to specify what data should be shown and how, filters to limit which rows will be shown, and sort criteria to specify the order in which it will be listed. And of course, the ability to expose controls for users to filter and sort the data in ways that meet their own needs makes this an extremely powerful way to make data available to your site's visitors. Now, we spoke a couple of episodes ago about how powerful it can be to use Drupal as the glass or experience layer through which visitors can interact with other systems. And I think this is another great example of that. So let's talk about Views JSON Source.
When Martin started talking about this module, I thought it was a way to export your JSON out through views, which I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know a use case for that. But now that I know that it's an ingestion method for you to ingest JSON feeds, I'm like, holy moly, let's use this everywhere.
Well, I'm speechless. There's many reasons why you would want to expose your Drupal data as a JSON feed, including decoupled sites. But I was going to say, this is kind of like the opposite of that. This is recoupling your site almost. It's pulling stuff in. I think my only question is, and if you haven't used this, you might not be able to answer, is, what's the performance like on this? I imagine the more dynamic filters you add or expose filters, the slower it is. But do you know about caching or how that works?
So I believe you can sort of specify caching settings for it. And so, depending on, I think it's tends to be time based. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to use cache tags in the same way that you would if the data was sort of natively housed within Drupal. But I would expect that, provided you have some kind of a sensible caching strategy there, it shouldn't be too bad, except for obviously that first request where you've got sort of, the dependency on the initial data source in addition to whatever processing has to be done by Views afterwards. Now, that being said, I have also worked on sites previously where, the site was actually using, JSON data that was generated by a third party system and actually existed on the same site. So there wasn't sort of like a lag for the JSON to be generated by some kind of a remote system. It was basically a flat file. So, depending on the strategy and where else that data lives, there might not be much of a performance hit at all.
I think another nice use case for this too, even as an admin tool, is if you are ingesting content from a third-party source, sometimes you want to slice that data differently, and that generally requires a developer to modify it. But if you expose this through some sort of view, you can have like a you know product manager or somebody else look at it and slice the data away and be like, oh, you know what, this is what we need to integrate into our system. That's an actual that's actually ingesting the information. They can kind of see the raw data coming through and filter how they want, and then make informed decisions. And rather than kind of having to sit with a developer and like manually look through raw JSON, which is never pleasant. So I could see use cases for this, even if it's not the end user that's finally seeing it, and there's some sort of intermediary process or migration or something. So yeah, pretty cool.
It's an interesting connection to the topic today, actually, Martin, right? And that, not to jump ahead, but today we're talking about progressive migration, and you'll see in a few minutes that I'm actually talking about delivering a single website from two different websites at one time, a Drupal 7 site and a Drupal 10 site. This kind of module would be great on, let's say, the Drupal 10 site, where I haven't quite migrated some content from the Drupal 7 site, but I need it to show on the Drupal 10 site. I could set up the JSON feed on the 7 site and pull it in with the view on the 10 site. So in that situation, I'm in complete control of both sides.
Yeah, interesting. I wasn't sure if there would be a connection, but it did occur to me that could be a potential way to leverage that. So that's very interesting.
Yep.
Sorry, I was just thinking that maybe the Talking Drupal site could use this module to import our Trello board information, so we could do a running list of like next shows coming up on the website from the Trello board that we use. Just looking to see if Trello offers a JSON export, which they do. So, yeah. And also, I was thinking about Google Calendars. I'm like, oh, you could probably import your Google Calendar that way too if you wanted to. But anyway, just two possible use cases for the audience out there.
Although the key is it's not an import, right?
Well, that's true. It's not an import. It's more of just an ability to view the data. But I mean, like, it's I don't know, and a way to make it nicer for front ends of sites to use, I suppose. Right. All right. Well, that was very topical and definitely got my wheels turning. So thank you, as always, Martin, for finding something that is on topic and thought provoking. If folks wanted to connect or suggest a module of the week, how could they go about doing that?
Thanks, John. We are always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Great.
Next week.
This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there has been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January 2025. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. I think we can all agree that migration, while beneficial, is not always feasible. This is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with core team maintainers of Drupal 7 to build and maintain their Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring that the same quality of support you have come to expect over the years. Drupal 7 Never-Ending Support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition, allowing your site to remain secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7 goes end of life. This allows you to migrate on your own time or potentially not at all. Hero Devs promises to keep Drupal 7 alive and well, even offering support for the current top 100 Drupal 7 modules. If you'd like to know more about Drupal 7 never-ending support, visit herodevs.com. That's HERODEVS.com. And now here's Ryan Price to tell us about the Northwest Drupal Summit.
Ryan Price here to tell you about the Pacific Northwest Drupal Summit. It's happening October 11th through 13th, 2024 in Seattle, Washington. This is a unique migratory camp that happens between Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, British Columbia, and it's the first time it's happened since the pandemic. We have a full program. On Friday, we're going to be having 2 trainings with a professional module development by Drupal Easy, as well as an introductory Drupal training, and a contribution room. On Saturday, we have a full day of sessions, and we have a whole building to ourselves, so that'll be really fun. And on Saturday night, we have our social event. And Sunday, we have another half day of sessions, and then you get to hang out and see Seattle. It has some really great sights, great food and drink, easy access to mountains, waterfalls, the outdoors, and a great music scene. So head over to pnwdrupalsummit.org. Call for papers is open now, and registration is opening maybe by the time you hear this. No flannel shirt required.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, let's move on to our primary topic. So, Stephen, let's start with the softball here. What is progressive migration?
So progressive migration is less about migration and more about progressive. It's a term. I don't know if it's a real term. It's a term we use on my team to describe a migration that's going to happen over a period of time. So we're taking a Drupal 7 site and doing the migration over an extended period of time. So sections of the website go to Drupal 10, and some sections of the website stay on Drupal 7. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay.
And what other types of migration are there? I mean, it feels like there's just 2 types of migration, right? Progressive or not progressive.
Non-progressive? Yeah,
All at once.
and I think that's one of the challenges, and I guess we get to this, is what we were up against is what is it going to take us to take the entire Drupal 7 site and move it to Drupal 10, and how do we do that as a project from a technology side and from a content side?
So can you just give a little bit of scope there? Like, okay, so we're talking about progressive migration, but what's the breadth of this, right? So we're talking a site with like a couple thousand pages, couple hundred pages.
Yeah, so let's back that up and talk about the site that we're discussing here. So this project is for the ATF, which stands for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. It's an agency that's within the Department of Justice. So the goal of this department is to basically provide control. It's law enforcement over firearms, explosives, arson, alcohol, and tobacco. More on the firearms and explosives and arson side today than the alcohol and tobacco. And the website we're talking about is atf.gov. So this is basically the public-facing side of this agency. And the agency and my department, which is the web media branch, it's a really small team of a few developers, a few content administrators, and we basically control all of that public interface to the agency. And it's 2 public websites. It's atf.gov and regulations.atf.gov. And to get back to your question, John, is like, how big is this thing? So the agency itself has like 250 field offices around the country. We have about 30,000 website pages.
Whoa.
And yeah, and it's a very, we call it like a living and breathing website. And what we mean by that is this is not a sales and marketing tool. It's public information that's changing every day. So our team of editors and content writers, they're maintaining, probably updating 250 to 300 pages a week of content. And that's anything from like press releases to gun trace reports to FFL, so federal firearm licensing information. That stuff is constantly changing.
And I think a critical thing here too is that a lot of that isn't necessarily driven internally, right? So if you're coming up with a new policy and you're informing the public about that, that's something that you're doing internally. But if there's a high profile case that you're doing a press release about, like that's driven by external factors. If there's a new law passed by Congress that you have to incorporate into all this into the site for some reason, that's externally driven. And a lot of times now, a lot of times these timelines are long enough for you to react to, but sometimes this content has to change very quickly.
It's a good point, Nick. There's a content that's coming from a lot of different places, and a lot of like the legislative content is very time sensitive. So, there's been two or 3 months of preparation for some announcement the president's going to make. He's going to make it at noontime on this day, and all of this information needs to be ready to go live immediately because there's going to be a public interest, I'll call it, in the topic that he's talking about. Is going to be a deluge of people coming to the website to get the details about this.
Yeah, and you can't just schedule. It's also something you can't just schedule for 8 a.m. right? Because he might be announcing it at 8 a.m. but something comes up and he announces it at 8:30 or like. So you kind of have to be like watching the news or whatever communication channel there is. Wait until it's been announced, and then you have to publish it. And like you said, hundreds of news organizations across the country are going to now be, and citizens are going to be looking at the site to get more information about that. So
What do you mean, Nick?
And the
Steven travels with the president so he can publish that
Exactly,
stuff right
right.
away.
and the content needs to be extremely precise too, because when it goes out and there's something slightly wrong with it, it's a big problem. So there's a lot of vetting that goes on the legal side before stuff gets published, and it's it's important information that goes out to the public, and it needs to be accurate, and it needs to be on time, and it needs to be easily accessible.
those
And
are
to give you an idea about the number of people coming to the site, so basically in the slow month, we have about 500,000 visitors a month. That's not the number of hits or that kind of thing, but it's about 500,000 people that are coming every month to the site on a slow month.
So thank you for taking us down that rabbit hole, Steve, on content strategy for ATF.gov. So what are some of the problems or challenges that you're trying to solve here with this progressive migration?
Yeah, so we're on Drupal 7. Like Drupal 7's ending, right? In January, I think for the final time it's ending.
Actually ending. It's actually ending in January.
It is actually ending.
Maybe.
Yeah. So the challenge we have had is the resources that it takes to maintain the site on a regular basis is the same resources that would be doing a migration. So it's a really difficult balance when you try to take a site of this size and move it to a new system. And for us, we didn't really want it just to be take the Drupal 10 site and move it to Drupal 10. We really wanted to make data model changes. We wanted to change the way page layouts were done. We wanted to do all the things that you would do when you go from D7 to D10. So there's a lot of technology changes underneath the hood. But in the meantime, it was also important that we did not, if you're going to go through 30,000 pages, that you don't want to move junk over to the new site. So it's really important to make sure the content, when it moved over, it got cleaned up. Because with the volume of content we have, there's a lot of that content that's news-related stuff. So it's press releases that don't change. So that's probably 80% of that content. Then that other 20% really needed to be vetted because a lot of it hadn't been looked at thoroughly in a while. So it was not just take this data, run it through a migration script and throw it over there. It really was, hey, we're going to look at this data. It's going to go out to the stakeholders. They're going to look at the pages. They're going to make some changes to them, and we're going to then move them live. So we couldn't just take and shut down the site for 3 or 4 months to just get all that stuff over. It can't happen because the site is like living and breathing. So it really was a resource problem to do a migration all at one time. So we needed to find a way that we could take sections of the site, focus on them from a tech side and then from a content side, and move them over in pieces.
So two questions come to mind.
Yeah.
The first one is, why not just, hire a secondary team, right? Where it's like one team is focused on the current site, keeping it up and running, and then the secondary team is building the new site, and then kind of working with the current team to kind of move content over as it in one fell swoop, or as it makes sense.
Yeah, there's a real simple answer to that is budget. I mean, the budgets for the agencies are pretty locked in for a long period of time, and they don't last that long. So they get a budget, and it's really for the resources you have. And it's difficult to, and I'm saying this really from my perspective. This might not be like the complete answer. I don't run the agency or deal with the budgets or anything like that. But it's difficult to just say, hey, we're going to take this huge chunk of money and just drop it in to get this project done.
Well, as a
Yeah.
taxpayer, I appreciate you guys being judicious with the tax funds. I think it makes.
And if you want some more detail about this, we talked with Abby Bowman and Laura Larimore in episode 334 about how you manage teams like this in government. And like Stephen said, like the budget is fixed, so the timeline is a bit less flexible, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to plan, I think, these migrations because you many times have something that truly is extremely urgent. Like there's a new law that's coming out, or there, like one of those things that we talked about. Like you end up with these situations where you truly have to drop everything and work on something else. You can't stop doing the maintenance work for 3 months. Where in a business, you might be like, you know what? We're not going to work on, maintaining things for 3 months. We're just going to work on this migration. We'll deprioritize everything else. We'll catch up afterwards. You can't do that in this type of situation. And I think that's the big thing that the progressive piece solves, is that when you have that slow week or that off week, well, you now have something you can dump those hours in. You can carve off another 2 or 3% of the site and migrate those. But if you have something more urgent, new functionality or a new press release or something, those hours get put towards that instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think Stephen answered my question, right? With like, hey, it was potentially budgetary considerations, which makes a lot of sense, because in business you would most organizations would just say, hey, we're going to spin up another team. Here's what the cost is going to be, and they're going to work on this thing full time, and we're going to get it done, and then we'll migrate everything over, right? But like that is money and hiring, and sometimes those things aren't necessarily easy or feasible.
You can, just to add a little bit there, you can do that easier with a tech team, right? You can bring a temporary tech team in to get some of the tech stuff done. That is much harder to do on the content side, because there's a lot of expertise in the content. And a big piece of what we're trying to accomplish here is make improvements to the words themselves, not just move them over.
So that's
and we debated, do we move them over and then clean it up? And we just are fearful of that. That's just was a bad way to do it.
You don't want to do that. You don't want to put garbage in the new system. But so that leads me to my second question, which is, sounds like it's kind of a manual content migration where people are kind of reviewing their stuff and updating their content, appropriately, and then putting it into the new system. Are you guys doing any like automatic migration, or is it all manual?
No, it's a combination of both.
Okay.
So like news items, press releases, there's a lot of content that was generated or came from other places that doesn't need vetting because it doesn't change a lot. And there's a lot of that stuff that we just bring over with Migrate API stuff. And then we vetted a lot of it. We vetted. So like when we brought over like probably 15,000 news items 6 months ago, we did do some cleaning up on the Drupal 7 side of that content. Things that we knew were wrong and needed to be fixed, like embedded URLs and junk like that. Some of it we fixed in the migration script, but there's a lot of that data that just kind of came over through running migration. But there is a lot of manual stuff that's going on too.
Got it. And I mean, I think that makes sense to your previous point. Like if you want to do content cleanup or there's content structure changes, like you want to make sure that you're capturing those appropriately. And sometimes it's just easier for a person to do that.
We have a lot of pages in Drupal 7 that are based on panels. So panels we use is like the page layout in 7. And like, how do we take those pages and put them now? What we're using is paragraph layout paragraph in Drupal 10. So how do we is that worth migrating that, or is it just better to do it manually? And we came to the conclusion that doing it manually is probably best for those pages.
And 2 more questions. Sorry. Using a design system?
Yeah, so government sites should be used in the US WDS design system. So that's one of the other advantages of us moving. Now this site is moving to the government standard for websites now.
Cool. And then you've said it, obviously you're migrating from Drupal 7, and I may have missed this, but are you migrating to Drupal 9, 10, or 11?
Yes.
Maybe?
So when we started this, it was Drupal 9.
Okay.
It's currently at Drupal 10, and so somewhere down the road we'll be moving to 11.
And you're finding, I'm assuming, the upgrade process from 9 to 10 and hopefully 10 to 11 pretty straightforward, pretty easy.
Yeah, that was pretty much a piece of cake. And actually, we probably started with 8. Actually, we probably went from 8 to 9, 9 to 10. The first thing that went live, by the time it went live, it was in Drupal 10. So during the growing of this project, it started at 8 and 9, and then it went live in 10.
Well, so how long have you been working on this migration then? When did it start? And when do you think it's going to end? You think you'll get done before Drupal 7 is?
Oh yeah, we'll be done. So when you look at the migration, there's like tech heavy stuff. The tech heavy stuff is really done. It's like we've got a Drupal 10 site that's in the layout that we want. We've got the data model in place. We're now heavy on content moving over. So we'll be done by January. It's just now we've got 2 or 3 sections over. We're about to move 2 more sections over. And it's just now it's sort of a routine to get the thing done. And we started discussing this 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, decided to do a progressive migration, and really started to develop it about a year ago. Started to actually put the whole thing together about a year ago.
Okay. And you mentioned that if I understand this correctly, you have the Drupal 7 site, but all the content is served from the Drupal 10 site. It's just like fed through a filter?
No.
So how does it actually work?
So let's talk about how it works. So you're familiar with an origin server. So an origin server is where your Drupal site comes from.
Yep.
And the reason why I say origin server is because we're going to talk about edge servers. So you have an edge server that is connected to your CDN. All right. So an edge server, if you think of a CDN, you've got this edge server that's got all of these servers around the world. You're serving content through a CDN. So the CDN talks to your origin server, and then your customers or your visitors basically talk to the edge servers. So what we've done is we're using a multiple origin server model, which means so our CDN talks to 2 origin servers. There's one that's on Drupal 7 and one that's on Drupal 10.
Okay.
So a key thing with us was we always wanted users during this progressive migration to never see that they were coming from a different URL. So if you go to atf.gov, you'll go into a Drupal 7 site today. If you go to atf.gov/careers, that page is now coming from a Drupal 10 site. So what happens is the CDN is like a traffic cop here. When you request a certain URL by path, so if you go to /careers or /news on atf.gov, it's serving those pages from a Drupal 10 site server.
Yep.
And if you go to all other places on the site, it's coming from Drupal 7. So people are actually seeing Drupal 7 and Drupal 10 based on what page they're on.
So,
And if you look at those pages, you can see subtle differences. That if you're on the careers side, you'll see that the headers and footers look different, but the color scheme and sort of the page width and stuff remain the same, because we don't want to be jumping the user between two obvious different sites, but they are different websites.
well, and how are you handling that actual routing? So when you migrate a new section, do you just have to update some sort of htaccess rule essentially, or
It's all
rule?
handled. It's all handled through the CDN. So the CDN has rules that when it sees a path, so the CDN is looking for. Before we did this, it was looking to anytime someone came to the site, it was looking what origin is this coming from? It's coming from this place at this hosting site, this IP address. Now what it does, it has another rule that says if someone's requesting anything that's /careers or in that path, I'm going to now pull that request over to this other hosting server that has the Drupal 10 site on it.
Okay, and what about editing? Because they're both going to be node/id/edit. How do you manage? How are you getting to the right origin
good
server
question.
for editing?
So to the public, we have www.atf.gov. That's the only thing the public can see. If you're internal to the ATF, you can see another website that's www.2. That is the Drupal 10 site. And connected to that are edit domains. So when a content editor is working on the Drupal 7 site, they go to edit.atf.gov. If they're going to maintain content on the Drupal 10 site, they're going to edit2.atf.gov.
Okay.
That kind of thing. So they're basically, and that's one of the challenges with this, is having content editors editing content in two different places. And we've had to come up with a few strategies to keep them sane while they're going through this process.
Now, Steve, the model that you've laid out here at the ATF, right, using a CDN and edge servers, that is very expensive, right? I'm going to make some assumptions here. And when you say origin and edge, those are terms that Cloudflare uses in their products. And Cloudflare's enterprise plan is going to be required to do this. So I just want to point out to the listeners that there are cheaper and free alternatives to do this model, right? So you can use Nginx and use the proxy paths directive within Nginx. You can also use proxy path within an Apache. You can use Fastly as well and set up various origins there, matching based in the VCL for Varnish to do redirection based on path. So there's a lot more options here than just what the ATF does. But the route that ATF chose is an expensive route if a smaller company, smaller agency having smaller clients were to do this in the way that you've laid out. I have done this, and I still do this for many of my clients, where I run Nginx as an HTTP proxy to split traffic by path, and then I will put a CDN in front of that, which is Fastly, or Cloudflare. And then performance doesn't matter as it being a bottleneck, because the public pages are cached in the CDN, and it doesn't really matter where the traffic's routed to after that. So
there's other expenses too. So it's not just that piece; it's also maintaining multiple servers for potentially having two servers that you're maintaining for a Drupal 7 site and a Drupal 10 site. There's expenses for that as well.
In government, it has a different model than in the private sector, right? Like in the private sector, especially the last several years, being a product-focused company that I've been running, is delivering value quickly. So this model works really well for my customers. instead of the traditional agency model where you to get a build project and you go, okay, we're going to build everything at once over a 3 to 6 month period, and we're going to deliver everything at the end, right? There's a lot of risk in that model, but that is essentially maybe a legacy service model of building websites. Is you're telling your customer, give me all this money up front and I'll see you in 6 months, right? But in this model of doing a progressive migration, you can sell a project and say, hey, we'll migrate you to Drupal 10, or we'll get you from WordPress or Sitecore over to Drupal 10. And we'll do it content type by content type, and we'll route traffic as we're done, and we'll provide you value as you go along. I have seen that over the last couple of years, especially, the stock market's going up, but I can tell you very much like our sector for work has been either flatlined or is on the decline, right? So like downward pressure on rates, downward pressure on a lot of things in our sector, that providing value as quick as possible to customers is really what has been keeping me going personally in the private sector.
And
Yeah.
the private sector also does this too. Like I have a client that that did a progressive migration from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, then 9, then 10, and they did it a little bit differently. They had a different use case. They carved out chunks of functionality of Drupal 7, and some of them they moved to completely new sites, for example. So like they took the blog, and now there's a blog.client.com. They took their career stuff, I think, and they moved that elsewhere. And then they just, when they were ready to start moving some core functionality, they just moved that to www and they weren't as concerned about letting people know that they were on different sites because they already had many sites under the corporate umbrella. So they just kind of did a www3 split. And we're actually, I think, 2 weeks away from finishing that migration. So that whole team is very, very excited. But there's other ways to do the progressive migration too that isn't as transparent to the end user, but still allows developers to carve that functionality out, kind of like what you were saying, Nate. Being able to show progress incrementally on different sections is valuable, even if it's on the larger corporate side. Because the thing is, this site, if we've been working on this, you've been working on it for what you said, 3 years, Stephen, a year, pretty head on.
Yeah.
We've been doing, I think we've been doing this for 6 years, 7 years. Like, there's no way we could have been like, okay, we're going to stop development for 8 years and build a new site and migrate everything over at once, right? That's nobody's going to go for that. So it's a great model for migration, whether it's functional or content based.
Steve said this before we started, when I candidly was like, when are you going to finish? And John, you'll make fun of me for this reference, but someone told me once, as I'm very much into my lawn and having a very nice lawn, is that a good lawn is never done, right? And like a good website is also never done. But back to the cost associated with this, right? Like, we don't want this type of migration to last forever in the terms of having dual infrastructure, paying that extra cost on the CDN side to do the origin and path routing. Like, that is ultimately like not what it might be budgeted for now with the government, but an administrative change could come in the next election cycle, and you could start seeing budget decreases and just speaking from headlines of what politicians want, whether they do that or not. Yeah. But it's, again, in the private sector, we're all feeling it, right? Like in the private sector, while stocks are up, most small and medium cap companies, their stocks are way down. Those are the businesses that I typically work with, right? And their budgets are a lot smaller than they were 2 years ago. Yep. So I think it would be a hard sell for me to be like, hey, it's going to take 3 years to progressively migrate your website, but it might be more appropriate in maybe an enterprise or government space to have that type of timeline, right? But I'm just curious, Steve.
To be clear, I just want to clarify something here. From our side, the technology really wasn't additional costs for us for this. We already had these infrastructures in place. It's the way our system was already set up. So it was really more of taking advantage of technology that we already had. So for us, cost was always a concern here, but it was the cost not of any technology changes. It was the cost of additional resources that potentially
Yep.
to get a single migration done.
I think
It-
that's super smart
Yeah.
using what you have, obviously.
Right.
You're also looking at over the long term, right? Like the upgrade cost to Drupal 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 into the future, in theory, will be less because you're not going major version to major version as you did in the past. It's not a rebuild, right? So like there's probably maybe a little additional cost here for extra servers and whatnot, but like that should be in theory decreasing and decrease maybe even further going forward because you're decreasing that upgrade cost. So
Yeah, knowing what hosting platform hosts most government websites, they are not in the game to decrease their hosting plans. That's for sure. You just need to completely get off of it.
oh yeah, we reduce your requirements.
Well, great. So, Steve, were some of the technical challenges that you all ran into? Right. So we covered the CDN portion of it, but what other technical challenges did you have with this progressive migration?
So I use the word challenge, like when you say the word challenge, so there was some hurdles. The challenges were really not difficult. And so the word challenge is a tough one to use here. There were just little things with Drupal that you have to overcome in the model that we're using. So, for example, a few of them are common paths is a good one. So if you think we now have two websites, one in 7 and one in 10. And I already described how the CDN was routing traffic based on path. Well, both of those sites have files that are in the same path structure. So if you think of like /sites default files, that's where when someone uploads a file, an image, that's where it goes by default. So in Drupal 10, the files are in the same path that they are in Drupal 7. So when we first turned this thing on to try to see how it would work, all of the files from, /sites /default /files are getting served from the Drupal 7 site, not the Drupal 10 site. Because it's not anything that you're going to pull from Drupal 10 now has to have a unique path. So the CDN knows where to pull it from. So things like that, something you ran into. So what do? Simple solution on Drupal 10. We changed that default setting. It's not /sites, it's sites2 /default files. So anything in Drupal 10 comes from a different path. So you have that same problem with JavaScript files, CSS files. Another similar example would be base path. So your base URL is defined in Drupal as a variable, and it's an important one because it's used in a bunch of places. Well, on Drupal 10, it was www2. On Drupal 7, it's www. Well, no one can get to www2 from the public. So we have to make sure that anytime content coming from Drupal 10 is served, it doesn't have www2 and it has www. So there's little things like that you'll find.
So you're enabling the reverse proxy settings within Drupal to accomplish that, right?
We did not.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we did is we took a really hard look at it to figure out those places that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually very few because we still wanted to keep www2 available. And we wanted to keep that site independent and not sort of mess with base URL too much for a whole lot of reasons of other things that were running. So what we found was there were probably 4 or 5 places of all the stuff running that we actually just put in a little bit of code, like a redirect. If a redirect has www2 in it, we just have a little bit of custom code that switches that. We only found like 4 or 5 places this actually was a problem. So it's one of those things that you don't see it's a problem until you're testing in this real environment, which is a key piece to this early on. You need to set yourself up in a way that from a test machine, you can look at your site during development as the public's eventually going to see it. So you can catch all these use cases.
Which DDEV can do, but that's not. And most of the tools to do that in DDEV are out of the box, but it takes some configuration to get that working for sure.
Something that comes to mind here is on the government side, how worried are you with SEO, right? Something that Nick had said earlier that I didn't comment on, but moving the blog out of the main URL to a subdomain, there's possibly a content marketer that is listening to this ripping their hair out saying you would never move your content marketing out of your main domain for SEO reasons, right? So are you less concerned as a government agency with SEO value of some of these pages with some of the decisions that you've made?
Yeah, it's a good question. SEO is not our primary concern, but it's not something we ignored either.
Yeah.
Right. Because people find us pretty easily and can find our content. So we were concerned about redirects. Redirects are a whole nightmare in this model. Not that they don't work, but understanding how they work, because redirects can now be coming from 2 different sites at one time to the same page. So we paid attention to SEO, but didn't worry about it.
Okay.
Because we never really, if you think about it, we never really moved anything.
Yeah.
The URLs always stayed the same, which was key for us. So as good or bad as our SEO was before, it's the same now.
I mean, my limited experience in government, working with a government agency, we were more focused on what you were saying early on, which is the information architecture of the website and easy readability. And one thing I'm really curious on is sitemaps. So you're running 2 separate sitemaps, right? So how did you accomplish merging those together?
Yep. Yeah. So that was interesting. So basically, our Drupal 7 site has a sitemap of all the content. So I assume everyone listening knows what a sitemap is, but it's an XML file with basically a list of every page that you want indexed. But a sitemap XML file has 2 formats. Like, one is the basic format that has a list of every node. The other format of that file is a sitemap index, which you can actually tell it where to find the real URLs that have the sitemaps in them. So basically what we did is Drupal 10 has a sitemap that generates all the content for Drupal 10 pages. Drupal 7 has a sitemap index that points to the index files on Drupal 7 and then includes the 1 and 10 at the bottom. So basically anyone going to the sitemap file finds it on Drupal 7, and at the bottom it includes the one on Drupal 10.
That's awesome. Yeah, that is having done this myself several times, that is the easiest solution. I did air quotes for the people listening. It's the easiest solution in doing something like this, but sitemap index is fantastic to route to different index sitemap files.
You got to be careful, because some people get fooled in thinking all they need to do is like go to their robots.txt file and say, hey, use this file for Drupal 7 and use this file for Drupal 10. But robots.txt file is just a recommendation. It doesn't force anyone to do anything. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So let's move away from the technical for a minute, right? Because I think we've outlined pretty well, how this is happening and kind of the challenges there. I'm wondering what types of non-technical challenges you ran into, because as much as like you see the technical challenges, there are a whole bunch of people and content editors and administrators like using this platform on the other side. So what were some of the non-technical challenges that your team had to kind of think about while implementing this process?
So I think one of them is, like any project, though, it's project management. When for a number of years, people have heard that there's a migration coming, going from the newest version of Drupal, going to the newest version of Drupal. And then this actually started to happen. And so I'll use the commercial word of business units within the agency. Their sections are moving and other people's aren't moving. And there's a whole management strategy there and issues they have to deal with. Well, how come their site's moving and our site isn't? When is our stuff going to move? So it's managing those expectations of this project that probably could have been done or finished 2 years ago and still is here now, and it's moving. It appears to be moving slower, but it's not actually moving slow. It just appears to everyone that it's moving slow. But when you're moving this amount of content, it's actually moving relatively quickly. Um, and then over a period of time, those business units want to have enhancements made to their section of the site. So it's a management challenge of, do we do them in Drupal 7 because we're not going to get to their section for 8 months?
Mhm.
So do we do them in 7, spend the resources to do that, and then redo them in 10, which we've had to do. We've had to,
Yeah.
we were talking, I think, before the show about features. Like, we use features, Drupal module features, heavily in Drupal 7. We're still doing that
Mm.
um, now because we're making upgrades to the software in Drupal 7 and then also making those same changes in Drupal 10. So there's a bit of that going on, which brings up another challenge. There was a question coming.
Yeah, I was just curious on the administrative side.
Yeah.
So like two things there, right? Like I imagine that you have two sites, right? And you have content editors editing content in various spots of each site. Like how do they know which sites to edit the content on? Is there some sort of process around that?
Yeah. So process one is sticky notes. Is, hey, if you're going to update the career section, go and do it here, not there. And that doesn't work so well, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
As
gonna
long
say
as
that.
people. So we've attacked this a few ways, and with degrees of success. One is you've got permissions in Drupal, which are super powerful. That you can, if you're actually taking an entire content type, turning it off in one site, turning it on in another, you can just simply say, hey, they try to go enter new news in the old site, they can't do it. It's off.
Right. Right.
But in most sites that are larger, it's not that straightforward. Sometimes there's a content type that covers 3 different sections of the site, but you're only moving one of those sections over. So the content type still exists. So you need to now buckle down and turn off them adding certain type of content within that content type. So you're updating taxonomies and things like that. So it gets relatively complex, but we've sort of section by section taken different strategies like that of turning things off, basically, is the issue. Or implemented messaging in the system that says, hey, when they try to do this, hey, by the way, do it on the other site. Kind of.
Right. So, and then is your team responsible for training, the new content editors? Because I imagine like the Drupal 10 interfaces and, layout paragraphs is different than like the way they do it in panels. So are you guys doing documentation and training for those folks?
So we're pretty self-contained. So all of the training SOPs, we have lots of SOPs for doing tasks. Those all have to be written for Drupal 10, updated. So people are getting trained in 2 different systems. And then, to layer on top of that, you have turnover like you would
Right.
in any department over a 2-year period. So as soon as someone gets trained, they may move on and then you get new people coming in. So there's all of that kind of management training. It exists. We've just made it more complicated for people by working in 2 different sites. But I think they're getting to the point now that they're comfortable with understanding that. But it was painful to start.
Can you give some examples of SOPs you had to put in place to make the progressive migration work? Like, if you had to distill it down to a couple of things, if somebody's looking at doing this themselves on a project, what are the 2 most important things that they maybe have to change in process to make it successful?
From a tech side or from any side?
From any side.
Yeah. All right. I would say from a tech side, if someone was interested in doing this, I think the most important thing is to understand how it's going to work, is to get an environment set up that you can see. I think we mentioned this a few minutes ago, but you can see how this is going to work from a tech side long before you need this thing to go live. In our scenario, it was basically in our CDN, which isn't the one that Nate mentioned earlier, by the way. in our CDN, does the CDN have the capability of setting up staging environments? So you can point to a stage version of the CDN and look at the site as if it's going to look like a year from now when you launch it. And that was like super critical for us. So I would test all of the tech stuff as early as you can and get the developers used to having content coming from two different sites. How does that impact redirects? How does that impact site maps? All that kind of stuff we mentioned earlier. So you can see that early on.
Okay.
Because when you find those things after you go live, it's extremely painful.
Okay, I was just looking at headers to
Yeah.
try to figure out which CDN you're using, and I noticed that the homepage is actually still Drupal 7.
Yep.
When do you think the homepage will switch over?
That's a great question. We've that's a great question. We've talked
By
about
sometime before January 2025,
yeah.
I bet.
that. It's funny. We just had a discussion about that recently. That we always like envisioned that is the last page that moved over, but it actually could move over at any time. So that's probably one we'll be moving over relatively soon. Yeah, because it doesn't matter at this point. Like we can take anything that's path based or file based and just move it. And we have much better tools on the Drupal 10 side for doing page layout and stuff now. So that page will probably come pretty soon.
Okay. Anything on the management side that you would change or wish you knew at the beginning? Because you gave us kind of the top tech tip.
Yeah, so that's not really my side of this, but I mean, as being a part of the team, I think this is a this is sort of a project management nightmare. And I'm glad I'm not doing it, but I think the communication and being communicating regularly with the business owners about the migration and where you are and keeping them involved the whole time is probably the most important thing.
So,
It's a pretty lame answer, but yeah, I think that's it.
Stephen, I want to touch a little bit on one thing that you said previously, but so like you when you go to each site, you don't notice a difference design wise, right? There are little things that you know because you're in it, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and you said earlier that you're using the US design system, right?
Yep. Yep.
Did you guys have to update the D7 site to look differently before you did the D10 site, or was that
No,
something
we
that?
left the D7 site looks exactly like it has for a number of years.
Okay, so you made the D10 site look like the D7 site, just with the new
Yeah.
design.
Yeah, we have it look similar, and it's
Yeah.
not the way we want it to look. We already have some designs of when the last sections are moved over. We have a path of how we're now going to take that Drupal 10 site and like make the pages wider, change the navigation, things like that.
Got it.
But it'll be more of a gradual change as we do that.
Yep, that makes sense.
And we're adding new features for the users too in Drupal 10 that they don't have in 7. And those are things that will just slowly come over time. One of the painful things I want to point out too is from a developer's perspective of keeping their head in Drupal 7 and Drupal 10.
Oh God, the times I have to go back to Drupal, like even going
Yeah.
back to Drupal 8 or 9 nowadays is painful. Going back to Drupal 7, like when I have a new client like asking for a migration or something, you have to look at something. The couple of times I've had to look at that Drupal 7 site for that client, it takes longer and longer to get in the headspace to remember even where to look for things.
Yeah, the
sites all
context
modules,
is
all that stuff.
context switching is really painful because we don't do a lot of coding in 7 anymore. We always try to avoid it unless it's one of those things that has to be done. And we have this site and we have a few other internal sites that are in Drupal 10. So it's the context switching that slows things down, and it just makes the job not so fun when you have to go back to features and stuff like that after using, config for so long. It's painful. And there's a cost. I mean, there's another, not a hard cost, but it's a cost to the team for being slow to do stuff.
So Steve, could you help me break down why you wouldn't do this migration strategy? What are the downfalls? And I know I brought this up earlier, but what are the downfalls on like cost, length of time for something like this? Yeah, and like this pain
I
point.
think you just hit the two. It would be. I think you just described what they are. I think the cost is an issue, and it's not just dollar cost, but it's the cost of time. Like we now maintain 2 code bases for Drupal when there's security issues and stuff. There's time that it takes to maintain 2 different sites that are really the same site. So there's a cost on that side. So the cost is, I think, the financial cost, the time cost, and while the ability for us to move slowly is an advantage for us and the reason we came here, it's also a problem, right? When it takes so long for something to get completely finished.
Yeah,
Um,
there's also a risk, right? So if you're doing a one-time migration and something changes, some priority changes, and you don't finish it, well, you still have just the one site to maintain. You can set aside the other one. If a priority changes at the ATF and they say, you know what, we all work on migration has to end. We have to focus on this other thing, and it's going to be a 2-year project, 5-year project, 10-year project, something like that. Well, you now have 2 systems that you have to maintain and update for 2, 5, 10 years or something.
well,
Like
that's exactly what's happened here, Nick. This project has halted over 3 years a couple of times because there were things that came up that had to be done, and they took 3 or 4 months at a time.
yeah.
So that has impacted us because we built in the ability for someone to do that, to stop us.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
The
it's probably
solution, yeah,
that's probably the advantage of Drupal 7 end of life now. Now you have something external that you can point to and say, we have to
exactly.
remain in compliance. We have to get off this. Or you're going to have to contract with Hero Devs, which it has
Right.
X dollar value associated with it, which makes it easier to justify
Right.
finishing the process.
I'm fully expecting we won't need hero devs, but it's good to know companies like that exist.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Steve. The length of time it takes to do this, right? And some of the disadvantages or challenges that you're facing now with the start and stop over the couple of years, right? Is that more of like a cultural issue, but I guess like a government cultural thing where you have different priorities with different administrations or different leaders that come in? Like, could a nonprofit or a private sector business have a very focused plan and execute this, right, and not let it drag on and start and stop, right?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, if someone has control over, so for us, there's, I would say, yeah, there's some of it that is related. Some of the delays are related to not necessarily high priority things that need to be done.
Yep.
Right. And if our feet were to the fire, could it have been completed 6 months earlier? Or a year earlier? That's probably true. But we have the flexibility. We built in the flexibility. Some of the content, bringing the content over really is sort of the slow part. Now the technology stuff is in place. The core. Once you bring the first piece over and it's live, whether it's 1,000 pages or 10 pages, you've kind of solved most of the big problems. It's now just an iterative of how fast can the team move and what now are the other priorities in place. So I think if I was, you're trying to ask if it wasn't a government project, would we done already?
I don't think that was the question. It was more along, we've just painted a picture that, this is going to take a while and you could have all these injections, but like, that's not every scenario, right? Like every scenario is different. You could have an organization, private, nonprofit, government that's saying, hey, this is a 6-month project. And then without the 6 months, we're going to release these pages iteratively, and we're all going to get to shut it down in 6 months, right? Like, I guess what I'm getting at is I don't want like people who are listening to be like, this will only work this way. And I think there's different flavors of how this could work for an organization that provides value quickly.
I think that though is based on priority, right? And that's what Steve's saying, right? There have been other things that have been a priority that need to get done regardless of a migration, right? And that happens in business too. You
Yep.
know, I mean, there could be an instance where the CEO could come in and say, hey, listen, this is the priority. Like this migration's got to get done in 6 months. And then 3 months in, he's got to say, well, you know, we have to shift priorities because of this merger, this thing, this other initiative, right? So, I mean, could it happen faster? Sure. Anything could happen faster. Like you could hire more resources. You could do things in business maybe a little bit easier to get it done faster. But I don't think necessarily like you'd be able to 100% remove some of those impediments.
Yeah, I think one of the big differences though, and then I have one final question before we go. One of the big differences is this system allows you to pause with there is spin up time when you get back to it, but there's less spin up time. I think if you're doing a one time everything goes migration and that gets paused for 6 months, 3 months, whatever, getting back to that, sometimes whole architecture changes happen and you have to redo migration stuff that was done. Whereas when it's progressive, since you're only focusing on smaller chunks at a time, the spin up time is less. Like there's some spin up time, so you have to remember where you were, what section you were working on, remind people what they reviewed, what they didn't. But the iterative spin up time is a lot lower. Yeah. Final question I have, Stephen, is because you said you're confident that it'll get done before January, but if you had a progress bar on this progressive migration, where are you at? Like, how much is left to migrate? Are you at 90%, 95%? How much content is left to go?
We're probably at 75%.
Oh wow!
Guessing somewhere around there.
So you guys are moving quick then, because
Yeah.
that's 7,000 to 8,000 pages, right?
Oh, there's page wise, we've got much more over there. We've probably got 25,000 pages.
Oh, but the last ones are a lot more effort to make sense.
It's more of this.
They did all the easy stuff first.
Yeah, you already said that. Yep. Makes
Easy
sense.
air quotes stuff.
Right.
Well, as always, Stephen, thank you for joining us and telling us what you've been working on for the last few years. It's definitely super interesting, and we'd love to hear more of your journey as you guys finish that up.
Yeah, great. It's great fun being here. I love talking to you guys. I miss the weekly Drupal conversations.
You can come back anytime you want.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal, just like Ryan did earlier. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And you can get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest host, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you to our patrons for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing that Become a Patron button in the sidebar. Alrighty. If folks wanted to get a hold of you, Stephen, to talk about progressive migration or the very important work that you do at the ATF, where could they best do that?
It's Stephen Cross on Twitter is probably the best place to get me. I just want to mention that I did a presentation at Drupal GovCon on this topic, which starts like in sort of baby steps and provides like the concept in general. So if you go to GovCon, or actually, I think there's a link in the show notes. The presentation is there.
There's absolutely going to be a link in the show notes. Nate, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how could they go about doing that?
The best way, you can email me, nathan@denzau.com. Denzau spelled DENTZAU. Or you can text me 401-753-3313.
I am not going to lie. That is the first time anybody's ever given a phone number on this podcast. Good on you.
Please send sales leads. Thank you.
There you go. Nick Laughlin, if folks wanted to chat with you, how could they best do that?
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Have a good one.